Hello and welcome to the Small Talk series brought to you by the Bagri Foundation. Today we're hearing about Indian and Western music with David Murphy and Jameela Siddiqi. Jameela Siddiqi is a critic, translator, broadcaster and novelist, having worked for the BBC and countless other outlets internationally. Her novels include The Feast of the Nine Virgins and The Bombay Gardens. David Murphy is a musician and a composer who's taking Western traditional music into new territory with his collaborations with Anushka Shankar, Ravi Shankar and the Royal Opera House. Without further ado, let's hear from David Murphy and Jameela Siddiqi.
Working with Yehudi Menuhin, the great violinist who worked with Ravi Shankar, that was really what opened my mind to the whole world of music. Because he'd been so affected by hearing Ravi Shankar play in India on his first visit to India, it hit him like a bombshell that there's this fantastic world of music that he, as a leading Western musician, had no idea of whatsoever. And he compared it to climbing up a mountain and seeing, as a Western musician, you see your sort of gods of Beethoven, Mozart, Bach over here, in the distance. You're sort of looking at all these wonderful composers, and it's like being tapped on the shoulder and saying, "Hey, but look over here. There's this amazing world of music that you don't even know just behind you, just as big a vista to explore." So that had a dramatic effect on him, and that was really what opened my eyes to all these possibilities.
You have a very high profile in terms of Western music and the work that you've done of the kind that involves Indian classical music. I've always wondered how that actually works. You're working with two entirely different... It's like constructing a sentence out of two different sets of alphabet techniques, isn't it? How do you...
It's a good way of putting it. Actually, I found working particularly with Ravi Shankar, the way that you can begin to get the two musics to come together is to go right back to their common roots. They could both, of course, involve sound. You can't have music without sound and silence. And if you go to the roots of sound itself, there you get the root of both musics. What I mean by that, I don't want to be too technical, but the Harmonic Series is common to Eastern music, Western music, all music. These mathematical relationships that are actually there in the sound itself, and that's why you have the tampura, which is basically usually tuned to the tonic and the fifth. The mathematical relationship of 2 to 3 and 1 to 2 in the tampura is very clearly there.
You're referring to particular ratios?
Yes.
Like we call them intervals, something like that?
Yes. I'm talking about the primacy of, say you're tuning the drone instrument, the tampura. Generally for a large number of ragas, you'll tune it to sa and to pa, so that in the West, the tonic and the fifth.
Yeah.
That ratio is fundamental to Indian music. It's also fundamental to Western music. And if you go back 1,000 years or more in Western music, you begin to get music where those ratios are still very, very important. And they're still there at the foundation of Western music as well. It's just they've been covered with all this other stuff. That
right.
If you begin to peel it away, you begin to get actually the common ground, the roots, if you like, from where both musics come from.
So like the modal music and
Yeah.
the Renaissance.
Yeah, exactly. And even pre-Renaissance as well, then you begin to get a place where you can both work, where you're not compromising at all, because the common ground is absolutely the same. And I like to think it's probably because originally we're told by anthropologists that the human race was born in Africa and gradually spread throughout the world. And there's evidence of musical instruments from sort of 32,000 years ago. People were making music then. And if one envisages those people gradually spreading throughout the world, you can see how the music originally would have been one thing that gradually grew in different directions, but at its core, at its roots, it's fundamentally the same. It's just a matter of going deep enough to actually reach those roots. So often in so-called fusion, people will come at making the music fit together from the very surface, the very top. And if they don't have a lot of time, they can try experiments, they can put something together very quickly. Maybe they'll be lucky and it'll sound okay. Generally, critics at least tend to think these things that are thrown together quickly sound pretty awful. And I think that is because things aren't gelling simply because people are not actually accessing the fundamental roots of the sound, the roots of the music itself. And that's something that Ravi Shankar was developing, and we worked together on his symphony along those lines, and also the opera that we began along those lines as well. So it's quite an exciting time to be a musician because you can begin to put all these things together, perhaps in a way that hasn't been done before.
What about other things like, strictly speaking, there isn't a concept of harmony in Indian classical music. You know, each note has got to be one at a time, absolutely pure, and it doesn't matter how quickly the notes succeed one another, they still have to stand out alone. The most basic thing for me is that Western music aims to create a mood. And I feel Indian music tries only to explore that mood. But it explores it in every possible way, from every angle, plummeting every depth, but never getting to the center. It does it from the periphery.
Right, interesting.
I feel that is its appeal because, you know, this is like esoteric stuff, but I feel like there's something core value at the center that is never revealed by the musician, but left to be discovered by the listener. And the more unqualified the listener, the better, because then they're not coming to it with any kind of musical prejudice or theory. So I think part of the appeal lies in the fact that there's something unsaid at the center which is never said. It's always held back. It's that degree of restraint, just keeping it. That's number one. Number two, if you look at the nature of how a rag is recited, it's not meant to be a piece from A to Z. This is it, this is what I know, this is the rag, here it is. It has to come each and every time, it has to reach the listener as though it's something they have just discovered, coupled with something that has been inside them since they were in the womb. So it has to sound very familiar, yet completely fresh. It's all these built-in contradictions that I find make the music interesting for me, because I mean, how else would I value it? How else would I appreciate it? I don't have the musical knowledge with which to appreciate it. It's something that I'm left with, but something that is not defined or clearly stated, but it's left to my imagination. It's like a blank space that I have to fill in as a listener, and I think being able to do that satisfies something creative, because believe it or not, I'm not a musician, but up there in my heart I'm pitch perfect.
Absolutely.
As is everyone else, you know, just sort of slightly out of tune, and I'm totally, my physiology is disturbed. So I don't know, that's one thing I look at, because, you know, I look at technical differences, and I look at, okay, now this intonation, no just intonation, no even temperament, you know, but none of that helps me to put the two aside. What helps me is this essential, how it is delivered and how it is received, because the Indian musician is not under any pressure to reproduce a faithful copy of the score.
Exactly.
And yet, I think, you know, I'm now trying to think in terms of antiquity, that the score itself as a historical document is of great value. I mean, I'm sure it enables Western musicians to go back to authentic copies of how did he mean this. And it might be full of markings and scratchings, but it would offer insights, whereas we have none of that, because in the age before recording technology, we have no way of knowing how the great maestros of the 18th century.
Sure. It's fascinating because the whole, I mean, there's so many things you touched on there that show the difference and also the similarities between the two musics. One of the key things with Western music, we had the development of keyboard technology in the West. You know, sort of, well, starting back in the 13, 14, 1500s, you know, keyboard instruments gradually became the central focus of Western music. And of course, that meant immediately the separation from the music's fundamental roots. You know, it was like a huge rift, because all of a sudden, if you have a key to press to get a note, then you go from one key to the next key, and the space between the notes disappears. So, you know, Western music from that point onwards no longer had this amazing space between the notes to explore.
Apart from the technological move forward, what do you think led to the piano type of instrument, or piano forte? Or what led to that being preferred? Was it to make it more widespread?
I think so. I mean, it was like, I guess, in Europe, the dominance of church music, and then every church had to have its own organ, and every church, well, would tend to compete with the neighbouring churches to have the best music department, the best choir, the best organist, and so things just snowballed, and organs themselves in churches got more and more ornate, more and more technologically superior as time went by, so, until you get to Bach in Leipzig with the most fantastic instrument, trying out all these amazing possibilities. Similarly, of course, in India, in Delhi or somewhere like that, you would have had great Indian musicians doing wonderful possibilities on their instruments. And if you could have brought the two of them together then, that would have been so fascinating.
Yes. Because as you speak, it just strikes me that, very similar thing happened with, instead of that beautiful melodic accompaniment from the bowed lute, the sarangi, everyone started opting for the harmonium. And again, this brings in your theory about the key. I mean, the harmonium was a box and more portable, and I think doesn't require tuning, does it? Apart from the normal servicing.
It's quite interesting that, because as a Western musician, I look at the introduction of keyboard instruments to India and think that's an absolutely terrible thing, because for a start, you're fixing the position of the note. So obviously the harmonium can't do microtones. One or two were actually constructed, I believe, in the 19th century that could. Just one or two, but it didn't catch on. So you're stuck with this instrument from the West with its fixed pitches. But it's funny, I've said this to really great Indian musicians, and they think it's absolutely fine. So who am I to say that that they really shouldn't be using this instrument? It's just something that's come from the sort of colonial days that's stuck there. It's very interesting how people adapt. From my point of view, coming at Indian music from the West, I think one of the greatest things for me, the real eye-opener, was the fact that you could move from one note to the next and enjoy that delicious space between them, and that nothing is fixed there. And it's the journey between the notes that's the expressive core of the music.
And the unsaid. It becomes the unsaid.
Exactly.
It becomes the silence between the spaces where your heart fills in a note that according to your mood. And that for me is it's a very active participation. Even as a listener, you're very alive. You're not just letting it.
Another example, actually, of how the instruments, began and then went in different directions to India and to the West. Turning into the violin in the West, perhaps the sarangi in India, but coming from the same basic root.
And the gypsies, of course, with their movements. But the violin is an interesting one. I think it's Irish missionaries, and this really puzzles me. Of course, it's a very deeply rich instrument, but violin sits in Carnatic music, in classical music of South India, like it was invented for that. Which is really something incredible when you think the music of South India was entirely Veena dominated, or Veena was the queen of South Indian instruments, but there's no South Indian musician who could ever imagine his or her musical tradition without a violin.
It's amazing. This capacity that India has to absorb things from other parts of the world is incredible, and make them so uniquely Indian.
It is incredible.
It is. I mean, cooking as well.
Everything. The Sufis, the cooking, the Mughals, the Turks, you name it, they've been there. But they've left, India sort of absorbs everything and everyone, but remains untouched in it. It is quite, I don't think I can name any other country like that.
Both the elements retain their beauty and their individuality, and yet you can see that underneath all of that, there's a unity as well.
There's a unity, but you never lose sight of the fact that there are two very strong traditions here. But I think the key to it was the fact that both instruments were being handled by people who were absolute, more than maestros. They were beyond, they were the maestros. So I think that also, given in less competent hands, anything that, how many fusion projects do I review a day? I think it could have been just a noise very easily.
And they both respected and loved each other so much, and worked so well together.
That came through as well. I think that came through as well, because around that time, another musician who trained with the same guru as Ravi Shankar, Ali Akbar Khan, he was like, a lot of Western musicians had discovered him and Sarod for the first time, and pronounced him the greatest musician, alongside Ravi Shankar and everyone else, because this was like, because this is a particular school of string. instrument in India. They are descended, or they're named after the court musician Tansen. The style of playing is the senia. It is not trying to sound like a voice. It doesn't want to be a voice. It wants to be the voice of the instrument rather than imitate the human voice. The tantric way of playing an instrument, where you treat the instrument with respect and you stretch it to all its limits and you display the instrument, which is an identical style. Of course, Ravi Shankar made huge modifications to the sitar to enable him to do things he was doing, but also remember he was in an age when sound amplification was the order of the day. It has had a very revolutionary impact on sitar playing techniques that would just not have been possible in the pre-microphone age. There were things like this going on, but at the same time there was a very specific kind of, this is the instrument, and this is how it sounds. Whereas the other schools that developed later and were not internationally as successful were all trying to ape the human voice. The singing sitar, the khayali sitar of Vilayat Khan, which is very beautiful style I absolutely love. But that's because I've got a head full of songs and lyrics and song text. So if an instrument is going to suggest those texts, it's going to be very, very welcome, but that is not the one and only purpose of playing a musical instrument, isn't to suggest the song text.
I think the instrumental approach appealed to the West very much as well, because in Western music you have Paganini on the violin, Liszt, these great virtuosi from centuries ago, and well, in the 20th century, of course, we had Menuhin himself, people like that, who really played the violin and knew all the nooks and crannies of the violin, had fantastic technical ability and so on, and explored what the violin could do. So it resonated with the West, I think. A musician coming from India, seeing what an instrument, taking it to its absolute physical limits.
Yeah, that's a very good point, because I think both of those senior players like Ravi Shankar as well as Ali Akbar Khan, phenomenal success, or at least they elicited a response. Whereas previously, somebody played a sitar, good, great, nice evening of music. It didn't have that impact of emotionally turning lives upside down, which they are supposed to have done single-handedly, from what I can make out. When did you become interested in Indian music from the beginning?
I was about 13, 14.
That's early.
Yeah, pretty early. I've been playing the violin just a few years. I started the violin actually quite late for somebody that became a professional musician.
What did you play before?
I didn't play anything before, actually. I went to a concert at age 10, and it was just a sort of house concert. Some friends of my parents had some children that played instruments. They were probably sort of late teens at that stage.
Let's come and see my children play.
Exactly, and I didn't really want to go, and I thought, this is going to be a miserable evening. I'd far rather stay at home and do something more useful.
Like, come and see my holidays.
Yeah, exactly.
Come and see my children play the piano.
But we went there. One of them played the violin, probably quite well. And as soon as I heard this, I knew that's what I wanted to do straight away. It was just one of those transforming moments.
An Indian maestro would say, "It's the violin that called you."
Right.
It's always that way around.
Right.
The instrument calls you. The music calls you.
Yes.
You are sent for.
Right.
So
there we go.
That was the evening.
Yeah. And from there, I then went to my school where they had lessons in school, and badgered the teacher there. I was too old to start age 10 because they started them at 6, and that was it was obviously too late. It began to feel like you're sort of geriatric, then you can't do what you want to do in life. But I persisted, and eventually I was allowed to start the violin. And because I so much wanted to play it, obviously things happened pretty quickly. And I was immediately obsessed and practiced an insane number of hours a day. But made fast progress as a result, and went to music school, and it was from there that I went to the Purcell School, actually in Harrow, where it was then, when I was 12, and it was through there that the whole sort of musical world suddenly opened up, and it was just fantastic to coming to actually quite late, and then having everything there. To explore, meeting people like Menuhin and so on, just incredible. So, and it was through that meeting with Menuhin, as I said earlier, that opened my ears to Indian music, because he in his teaching he would talk about Indian music, the microtones, the moving from one note to another. Even in teaching Western music, he had such a wide-ranging mind. He definitely, as a result, I think, of all his work with maestri like Ravi Shankar, had a completely different worldview to any other Western artist I'd ever met, because the context was so huge. Okay, you may be playing a sonata by Beethoven, but that's something in in the context of the music of humanity, not
canvas
just,
is huge, and you might just be playing one specific thing, but the canvas comes through in terms of what this is laid on, everything that's in it. It's quite amazing. But the majority of people who come, like on my courses, or who come to listen to me speak, the first question they ask me is, how do you distinguish the rags? And I'm like, that's the least important question. Why don't you listen to the content rather than worry about the label? Oh no, but how does one tell them apart? Well, one doesn't. But coming so many years on, and I remember being there, being in that place where I'm thinking, why does this one sound almost like it's going to go that way, but then it doesn't? Now that's the only vocabulary a non-musician has to describe something, so I haven't a clue what the names are or what they are. It was just like one big glossary with too many names. I am Indian, but I'm an insider who's an outsider. I speak Indian languages and all the rest of it, but I had no way to reach music, not having studied, not having, my first degree was in European history. I can tell you all about the rise of Nazism between the wars. I can tell you about fascism. I can tell you about the reunification of Italy and Germany. And yet, having done that, I didn't do Western music history, and I had no idea of this other side of the mountain that was waiting there. But having made that journey, and now finding people who ask the same questions. But these are people who can click on Wikipedia. They can see the difference between a sarangi and a saranda and a dil, I had none of that. But it found me, or I found it, whichever way, and life was just never the same again.
And you said about creating something inside that contributing to the performance from inside.
It's a dimension you're unaware of till it happens. It doesn't make you a composer.
No.
It doesn't make you a musician.
You have to sort of let go of things for that to happen as well, don't you? Have to.
That's right. It makes you go very deep inside yourself. To do that, you go very deep inside yourself. You could only do that if you're not afraid of the demons. I was on the verge of then writing a novel, but of course I didn't know I was. But my entire novel is driven by music. And now when they teach it on literature courses in America and elsewhere, one of the questions the students always get is to write an essay about the role of music in my novel. The fact is, whether I was writing dialogue or I was writing a saucy scene music was never too far away. In fact, the only recollection I have of writing that novel is there was a soundtrack in my mind. I wrote it to that track.
Right.
There was something playing that I couldn't play for you. I couldn't even notate it for you to play. But there was a sound, and against that sound I wrote I used to be a documentary producer many years before I discovered Indian music, threw everything out.
Right.
And it's exactly how I worked on my films or documentaries. I didn't make films, but documentaries. I would sit down with the script paper, and first, you have 3 columns. The scene number, what the picture's doing, and what the sound is doing. I would write my sound column first. Right, so shot 1, right, birds singing, a little bit of chirping, Next scene, I'm just thinking of the sound, nothing else. When my sound script was done, I could turn to the what it should show.
Yeah.
Always that.
Shows your priorities.
Totally, totally driven by sound. So maybe it's not that surprising that I eventually came to music, but it was a role that I was very aware was going to be a weird one. And in time, people started asking me because it came across like I was someone who knew. I didn't really. I didn't really know, but more and more gramophone were asking me to write, and song lines, and BBC actually came to my place to persuade me to do a trip and record music. It didn't come across to them that I'm actually still trying to work out what my reaction is and why it is.
It's your relationship with it, though, isn't it?
It was the relationship people were viewing.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm now aware of it. I'm thinking, well, is that what it was? They were looking at the impact that music was having on me without my being able to verbalize it. It just looks like I know. And even to this day, I don't actually know. I don't mind admitting I know nothing about music except what it makes me feel.
Yeah.
And knowing is very different to feeling, isn't it? And I have this absolute problem in that I still think that I don't know, but people seem convinced I know, and I think it's because maybe I've found a language, the words, with which to describe what is happening or what might happen or what to look for. It's not an absolute theory. It's not a verbal equivalent of what is being played. There is no verbal.
Sure.
Music is a language in its own right. But maybe I'm aware of having formed some kind of bridge between the performer and the listener. And maybe, you know, because I am a writer, I'm a professional writer, maybe I've just hit on the right language, and people are somehow convinced I'm a expert in music. There is no expert in music. There isn't such a thing. I don't know. Does that amount of ecstasy, that amount of spiritual upliftment, is all that contained in Western music?
I think it is. The difference perhaps is that in Western music the spiritual element isn't necessarily the goal, if you like. I mean,
Bach?
Well, yes, exactly. With religious music, with Bach, Beethoven, Missa Solemnis, for example, then yeah, absolutely. And I think because the same core is being touched. I mean, the amazing thing about music, you talked about stringed instruments earlier and how the vibration seems to touch you. And there was a Swiss scientist called Hans Jenny who actually did experiments with how you could make what music sounds like appear for people. In other words, what he would do is very simple. Actually, he would play a sound through different medium, maybe a liquid, maybe lycopodium powder on a drum, and you'd get obviously these wonderful patterns made by the sound itself. Very simple. One can do it on the drum, just like that. You put sand on the drum and you play the drum, and you get beautiful concentric circles, or maybe fern-like patterns, depending on how the drum's tuned. So he took this a stage further, and he'd play sounds into his machine that he'd constructed, and it would show really how if we could only see the sounds around us, how the air molecules would be vibrating and moving. And these are always, without fail, if the sound is melodious and the ratios are pure, very, very beautiful patterns to look at. Very similar actually to Indian mandalas, to the meditation patterns. And of course this is common to the music of the East and the West.
Yes, well, Sufi Inayat Khan equated colour with sound, and actually gave a spectrum of how that's quite amazing.
And Scriabin, of course, with who is putting that together.
That's
sounds
right.
and sound, colours and music.
I think it was in that connection he went to the Sufi master.
Yeah. So it's something for the future, I think, to be able to actually see the sound that you create. And it's something that in Ravi Shankar's opera we want to hint at, because this was something that fascinated him. The fact that something I bought him actually a couple of years after we started working together was one of these pictures of sound created by the Swiss scientist.
Okay.
And his eyes just lit up because you could see immediately all these connections being formed. And when we came to the opera, that was something that he definitely wanted to include, but very subtly, but so that the Western audience could pick up this connection between sound and matter, which Nada Brahma is the centre of Indian music. The world is sound, and that everything in creation is ultimately vibrating.
Cosmic, earliest.
Exactly. And he wanted to show this in hopefully, if we can get this across very subtly for the Western audience in the opera itself, but using this the kind of projections and so on that we're planning. Hopefully that's something that will be revealed for the audience. Going back to the world being sound, Nada Brahma. What really fascinates me at the moment is some of the latest scientific discoveries about the origin of the universe. In that, hearing the background radiation of the Big Bang, and some of the research that's being done about these actually being acoustic waves. Look at the patterns that they're forming are acoustic, and that just so beautiful. This doesn't it? It just sort of grabs you. This whole tradition of in Indian music of the world being sound, and Christianity in the beginning was the word. All these things, the sound actually being the thing that forms everything, that organises everything. Last night actually I saw a documentary saying that mathematics was the foundation of the universe, because of course these mathematical structures are there. And to the Greeks there was no difference between mathematics and music.
There wasn't to Indians either.
Yeah, exactly.
Music is maths.
Yes, music is maths. It's these ratios, it's audible mathematics, and mathematics is sort of codified music, if you like, written down music. So that whole unity, I think, is absolutely incredible.
It's amazing.
And if we're aware of that, we can't really be too worried about differences between the music of India and the West. You know, if you see the really big picture, you know, you begin to see how everything fits together, everything is connected. And I think in this time of globalisation right now, the world's got so many problems, so many issues. We've got terrible refugee crisis and so many things in the world at the moment. But if we can begin to see the big picture, and we can use things like music, the arts, to begin to heal some of those differences and see where everything's joined together. I think that makes music and the arts play a really vital role, perhaps the most important role, really, in the next sort of 20, 30 years.